The specimen's eyes opened. That should have been impossible. Marcus Thrale had dissected enough plague victims to know the signs of true death. The corpse on his table exhibited every one of them. 0 pulse for 47 minutes. Skin temperature matching the frigid undercity air. Lividity settled in the dependent tissues. The infection had consumed the man completely, transforming his blood into something that resembled fermented slime more than anything meant to sustain life. Yet those eyes opened, pupils dilated, found Marcus across the laboratory chamber. The corpse smiled. Marcus dropped his scalpel. The metal instrument clattered against stone, the sound impossibly loud in the vaulted space beneath the ruins of Lord Aron's capital. Around him, dozens of examination tables stretched into the greenish gloom, each bearing its own burden of experimental failure. Some subjects had been human once. Others were scourge specimens captured from the plague lands. A few defied classification entirely, amalgamations of living tissue and necromantic energy that the Royal Apothecary Society had created in their desperate search for a weapon against the Lich King. All of them were supposed to be dead, completely, irreversibly dead. The specimen sat up. Y-cord dripped from the Y incision Marcus had carved into its chest 3 hours earlier. The spreading pool of fluid hissed against the examination table's treated surface, releasing vapors that stung Marcus's eyes even through his protective goggles. "You're Thrale," the corpse said. Its voice emerged wet and bubbling as though speaking through a throat filled with rotten honey. "Master Farinel's assistant. The one who thinks he's developing a conscience." Marcus's hand found the alarm crystal mounted on the wall beside his workstation. He didn't activate it. Not yet. In the apothecarium, asking for help was often interpreted as admitting incompetence. Incompetence, in turn, meant becoming the next subject on an examination table. The Royal Apothecary Society had very specific ideas about the value of failed personnel. "How long have you been conscious?" Marcus forced his voice to remain level. Professional detachment had become his armor during these months beneath the city. He'd learned to treat horror as data, suffering as experimental metrics. The alternative was madness. The specimen tilted its head, studying him with eyes that now glowed with sickly luminescence. "Since you made your first incision, I felt everything, Thrale. Every cut, every probe, every sample you extracted from my organs." Its smile widened, revealing teeth that had begun to elongate into something predatory. The new plague doesn't simply kill anymore. It transforms consciousness, makes us better than human. Better than Forsaken. We become something Arthas himself would envy. The implications detonated in Marcus's mind like alchemical bombs. The specimen he'd been dissecting wasn't a plague victim who'd spontaneously reanimated. It was one of the deliberate test subjects from the blight experiments Master Apothecary Farinel had been conducting in the deepest levels of the Undercity. The ones nobody discussed during meetings with War Chief Thrall's overseers. The ones that weren't supposed to produce viable results, let alone sentient specimens capable of experiencing their own vivisection. Marcus had volunteered for the Royal Apothecary Society 6 months earlier, drawn by promises of defending the Forsaken from their enemies. He'd been a physician before the plague of undeath claimed Lord Aron, before he'd woken as one of the undead, his memories of life intact, but his body transformed into something that no longer needed to breathe or eat or sleep. Lady Sylvanas Windrunner had given the Forsaken purpose: survive and destroy those who would see them annihilated. The Scourge, the Scarlet Crusade, anyone who viewed the undead as monsters to be purged rather than survivors deserving of existence. The new plague had seemed like salvation, a weapon capable of killing both the living and the undead, something that would level the battlefield and give the Forsaken a chance at genuine security. Marcus had believed he would be saving lives, or at least saving his people from extinction. He'd discovered the truth during his first week in the apothecarium. The research chambers extended far deeper than the official map suggested, tunneling into bedrock that had once formed Lord Aron's dungeons. Marcus had descended those spiraling ramps countless times, transporting specimens and supplies to colleagues who worked in near-total isolation. Some of those colleagues had stopped speaking to him after a while, their minds eroded by prolonged exposure to the experimental compounds. Others had simply vanished, their names removed from personnel rosters without explanation. Master Apothecary Farinel oversaw it all with the enthusiasm of a scholar pursuing fundamental truths. Where others saw suffering, Farinel identified variables. Where ethics might constrain lesser researchers, Farinel simply recalibrated his experimental parameters. The dead couldn't object to being used as test subjects, he'd explained during Marcus's orientation. The Forsaken themselves were proof that the line between life and death meant less than people assumed. But the deeper laboratories weren't housing dead specimens. They contained living subjects, prisoners mostly, claimed from Alliance territories through raids that the official records carefully omitted. Scarlet Crusaders who'd been captured during skirmishes. Villagers from outlying farms who'd made the mistake of wandering too close to Forsaken territory. A handful of scourge abominations that the apothecaries had partially cured before injecting them with the new plague to observe the interaction between competing necromantic formulae. Marcus had learned to ignore their screams. Sound carried strangely in the Undercity's depths, echoing through stone corridors until human suffering became mere ambient noise, no different from the drip of condensation or the hiss of alchemical distillation equipment. He'd told himself the work was necessary, that every subject contributed to the eventual weapon that would secure the Forsaken's future. He'd been lying to himself. The specimen on his table wasn't finished speaking. "You've seen the field hospitals, haven't you, Thrail? The ones Lady Sylvanas ordered established along the Hillsbrad border. Beautiful cover story. Humanitarian aid for refugees fleeing the scourge incursions from the north. Very compassionate. Very strategic." The reanimated corpse's smile became something terrible. "Those hospitals are just another layer of the experiment. Every patient who passes through their doors receives a modified variant of the blight. Something subtle. Something that won't manifest for weeks or months, long after they've returned home to their Alliance communities." Marcus's blood would have frozen if it still flowed through his veins. The field hospitals had been Lady Sylvanas' attempt to improve relations with the Alliance, or so the official proclamation suggested. After the disaster at Wrathgate, where Grand Apothecary Putris had unleashed the blight against both Alliance and Horde forces, the Forsaken had been struggling to convince their Horde allies that the weapon's use had been an act of betrayal rather than sanctioned policy. The field hospitals were supposed to demonstrate the Forsaken's commitment to healing rather than destruction. Marcus had never considered they might be vectors for something worse than the obvious warfare. "You're lying," he said, but his voice carried no conviction. The specimen could be lying. The new plague might have damaged its cognitive functions, producing paranoid delusions or false memories. But Marcus had read Farinel's research notes. He'd seen the coded correspondence between the Master Apothecary and Grand Apothecary Putris before Putris's death. He'd helped prepare the specialized plague strains designated for long-term deployment scenarios. "Venus," the specimen laughed, a sound like bones grinding together. "Check the manifests, Thrail. Cross-reference the patient intake numbers with the latest batch of blight shipments. You're a physician. You know how to spot the patterns in epidemiological data." It slid off the examination table, landing on feet that should have lacked the musculature to support its weight. The ichor dripping from its open chest cavity was already beginning to congeal, forming a protective shell over the exposed organs. "Better yet, check the shipment that left for Terran Mill yesterday. 47 crates marked as medical supplies. Bandages, antiseptics, pain remedies, and a very special compound meant to be added to the field hospital's water purification system." The door to Marcus's laboratory burst inward. 3 figures in the distinctive robes of senior apothecaries swept into the chamber, their movements synchronized with military precision. Behind them, a pair of Forsaken death guards gripped serrated axes, their eyeless faces turned toward the reanimated specimen with something resembling professional interest. Master Apothecary Farinel entered last. His skeletal frame was draped in robes that had once been elegant, but now bore the permanent stains of chemical experimentation. Where his face should have displayed concern or alarm, Marcus saw only mild irritation. "Subject 27 has breached containment," Farinel observed, his tone suggesting he'd noticed a minor procedural error rather than a walking corpse that had survived dissection. "Thraile, I'm disappointed. You were instructed to maintain anesthetic suppression throughout the examination." Marcus found his voice. though it emerged hollow and distant. Master Apothecary, the specimen claims the field hospitals are... The specimen claims many things. Farinell waved a desiccated hand dismissively. Exposure to the new plague produces temporary psychosis before the consciousness stabilizes. Subject 27 is experiencing the transitional phase. Nothing more. He gestured to the death guards. Restrain and return it to the primary containment chambers. We'll need to revise the neural suppression protocols before the next dissection cycle. The death guards advanced. Subject 27 didn't resist. It simply maintained eye contact with Marcus as the guard's hands closed around its arms, their grip strong enough to crack bone. Ask about Project Whispering Death, the specimen said. Ask what happens when the Alliance physicians discover they've been administering a slow-acting plague to their own populations. Ask how Lady Sylvanas plans to raise the resulting casualties as new Forsaken, expanding our numbers while simultaneously crippling the Alliance's demographic base. One of the death guards struck Subject 27 across the jaw, silencing it. The specimen's head twisted at an unnatural angle, but it continued smiling even as the guards dragged it from the laboratory. The door sealed behind them with a pneumatic hiss. Farinell approached Marcus's workstation, his fingers trailing across the contaminated examination table. The pooled ichor had begun to emit a faint phosphorescence, casting sickly light across the Master Apothecary's partially decayed features. Project Whispering Death is classified above your clearance level, Farinell said quietly. However, given your obvious distress and your otherwise exemplary service, I'll provide context. Yes, the field hospitals serve a dual purpose. Yes, we are introducing modified plague variants into Alliance populations, but you must understand the strategic necessity, Thrail. The Forsaken number perhaps 20,000 conscious undead. The Alliance and its allies control populations exceeding 1 million. We cannot achieve security through conventional military means. We require alternative methodologies. Venum. Marcus felt something inside him. Something he'd thought the plague of undeath had destroyed along with his heartbeat. Rebel against the calm rationality in Farinell's voice. You're talking about genocide. About transforming entire civilian populations into undead against their will. That's exactly what the Lich King did to us. We're becoming the same thing we're fighting against. We are becoming survivors, Farinell corrected. The living will never accept our existence, Thrale. History has proven this repeatedly. The Scarlet Crusade seeks our annihilation. The Alliance tolerates us only because the Horde vouches for our utility. Even our Horde allies view us with suspicion, stationing overseers in our capital to monitor our activities. His voice hardened. Project Whispering Death gives us agency. When the modified blight activates, 3 months from initial exposure, perhaps 6, we will be positioned to offer salvation. Alliance populations will face a choice between extinction and transformation into Forsaken. Many will choose survival. Those who do will swell our ranks with skilled professionals, trained soldiers, valuable citizens who can contribute to our society. And those who refuse? Farinell's smile contained no warmth. Natural selection operates on populations that make poor survival decisions. Marcus looked at the instruments scattered across his workstation. Scalpels, probes, beakers containing samples of tissue and fluid extracted from dozens of experimental subjects. He'd convinced himself this work served a defensive purpose, creating weapons the Forsaken could use if threatened with extinction. But there was nothing defensive about infecting unsuspecting civilians through fake humanitarian aid. Nothing necessary about transforming living populations into undead without consent or warning. He was complicit, had been complicit for months, possibly longer. Every specimen he'd dissected, every report he'd filed, every experimental protocol he'd refined, all of it had contributed to Project Whispering Death. All of it had enabled something monstrous. I want no further part of this, Marcus said. The words felt inadequate, but they were all he could manage. Farinell regarded him with something resembling genuine regret. I feared you might reach this conclusion. You're a talented researcher, Thrale. Your pre-death medical training gives you insights that most of our apothecaries lack. It's unfortunate that your conscience survived the plague of undeath. Most Forsaken are fortunate enough to lose such impediments. He reached into his robes, withdrawing a vial filled with amber liquid that seemed to writhe with internal motion. This is a refined variant of the new plague, specifically engineered to suppress higher cognitive functions while maintaining technical competency. You'll retain your surgical skills and research abilities. You'll simply lose the capacity to question orders or experience ethical qualms. The other apothecaries moved to flank Marcus, cutting off any escape route. Not that escape was possible. The Undercity's depths were a labyrinth, and Farinel's influence extended throughout every corridor and chamber. Even if Marcus reached the upper levels, where would he go? The Horde would never believe accusations against the Royal Apothecary Society without evidence. The Alliance would execute him on sight for being forsaken. Lady Sylvanas herself had approved Project Whispering Death. The specimen's testimony and Farinel's casual admission made that obvious. There was nowhere to run, no authority to appeal to, no way to stop what was already in motion. Marcus's hand closed around the alarm crystal. Not the internal one that summoned Forsaken security, but the secondary crystal. The one connected to external communication channels. The one that could transmit beyond the Undercity's boundaries if properly calibrated. He shattered it against the wall. The crystalline fragments detonated in a burst of arcane energy, cascading through the Undercity's communication network with the force of a malfunctioning ley line. Somewhere in the distance, Marcus heard other crystals answering the call, their harmonic resonance creating feedback loops that would propagate throughout Lordaeron's remaining magical infrastructure. The signal would be scrambled, incomplete, but it would reach beyond the Undercity's walls. Someone would investigate the magical disturbance. Maybe the Argent Crusade, maybe the Cenarian Circle, maybe even Horde intelligence if they had monitoring stations nearby. The evidence was here. The specimens, the research notes, the shipment manifests connecting the field hospitals to experimental plague variants. All of it could be found by anyone who knew where to look and had the authority to demand access. Farinel sighed. Dramatic, pointless, but dramatic. He nodded to the flanking apothecaries. Restrain him. We'll need to... The explosion cut off whatever Farinel had been about to say. It came from deeper in the laboratory complex, powerful enough to make the stone floor buck beneath Marcus's feet. Secondary detonations followed, each one closer than the last. The air filled with screaming. Not human screams, but the shrill mechanical wail of ruptured alchemical containment vessels releasing their contents in uncontrolled cascades. One of the flanking apothecaries lurched backward, clawing at his face. Where his hands touched flesh, the tissue began to slough away, revealing bone that immediately started to liquefy into something resembling candle wax. He collapsed, still screaming as the experimental compounds ate through his body from the outside in. The second apothecary tried to flee. She made it perhaps 3 steps before the spreading cloud of green vapor reached her, and then she was dissolving too. Her robes and flesh melting together into a writhing mass that continued to move even after no recognizable human shape remained. Farinel stumbled away from the spreading contamination, his expression shifting from irritation to something approaching actual fear. Subject 27, he breathed. It must have triggered the containment failures before the guards. Another explosion. This one close enough that Marcus felt the concussive force slam through his chest. The laboratory's walls shuddered, cracks spiderwebbing through ancient stonework that had stood since before Lordaeron's fall. Through the expanding fissures, Marcus glimpsed other chambers, research stations where specimens in various states of decay were beginning to break free from their restraints, animated by the chaotic magical energies cascading through the complex. Project Whispering Death's test subjects were escaping, and they were hungry. Marcus ran. Behind him, Farinel was shouting orders to personnel who were no longer listening, trying to organize containment protocols against a disaster that had already progressed beyond any hope of control. The new plague variants were loose in the Undercity's depths, and every Forsaken they touched would either die permanently or transform into something worse than simple undead. The specimens knew the research facility's layout. They knew which chambers contained the most dangerous compounds, which systems to sabotage to maximize the cascade failures. Subject 27 had planned this. had allowed itself to be captured, dissected, and studied specifically to gain access to the laboratory complex at a moment when it could cause maximum damage. Whatever the new plague had transformed it into, it wasn't loyal to the Royal Apothecary Society. It was something else entirely. Something with its own agenda. Marcus emerged into one of the main corridors, gasping for breath he didn't technically need. Around him, other researchers were fleeing the lower levels, their faces twisted with panic. Several bore the telltale signs of plague exposure. Skin taking on a greenish pallor, eyes beginning to weep black ichor. They wouldn't survive the next hour. Most of them had probably contributed to Project Whispering Death in some capacity, had helped refine the methods that would be used to transform unsuspecting Alliance civilians into unwilling Forsaken. Marcus felt no pity for them. He felt nothing at all. That realization was almost worse than the horrors unfolding around him. The Royal Apothecary Society had worn away his capacity for emotional response so gradually that he hadn't noticed it happening. He'd become the thing he'd feared. A researcher who could witness atrocities without flinching, who could rationalize suffering as necessary sacrifice, who could participate in genocide while convincing himself he was only following orders. But he'd broken the alarm crystal. That had to count for something. Someone would investigate. The evidence would be found. The truth about the field hospitals and Project Whispering Death would emerge into daylight, where even the Horde leadership couldn't ignore it. Assuming anyone survived long enough to conduct that investigation. Marcus reached the main elevator shaft, only to discover the lift platform had been disabled. Through the open shaft, he could see dozens of Forsaken crowding onto the upper levels, trying to reach the surface before the contamination spread beyond the research complex. Some were researchers. Others were the maintenance workers and functionaries who kept the Undercity operating. A few were the Death Guards who were supposed to maintain security, but even they seemed more interested in preserving their own existence than containing the disaster. Something moved in the shadows behind Marcus. He turned, expecting to find Subject 27 or one of the other escaped specimens. Instead, he saw Master Apothecary Farinell. The man's robes were shredded, hanging from his skeletal frame in tatters. His left arm was missing below the elbow, the stump ending in a mass of cauterized tissue that still smoked faintly. But his eyes were alert, focused, and filled with terrible purpose. In his remaining hand, he held a crystal vial containing liquid that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. "This is your fault, Thrail," Farinell said. His voice was steady despite the devastation surrounding them. Subject 27 would never have gained the opportunity to sabotage the containment systems if you had maintained proper anesthetic protocols. You allowed your incompetence to endanger everything we've built. Marcus backed toward the elevator shaft. "What's in the vial?" "Concentrated blight. The original formula, undiluted. Putris used a version of this at the Wrathgate. It killed hundreds of Alliance and Horde soldiers in seconds. This sample is stronger." Farinell's skeletal smile stretched wider. "I was saving it for the final phase of Project Whispering Death. But circumstances require adaptation." He threw the vial. Marcus caught it on reflex. His fingers closed around the crystal container, and immediately he felt the contents begin to react to his body heat. The vial was warming, the pressure inside building toward an explosive threshold. Farinell was already gone, vanishing back into the smoke-filled corridors with the speed of someone who'd spent years navigating the Undercity's depths. He'd left Marcus holding a bomb that would detonate within seconds, releasing enough blight to kill everything within a 100-foot radius, including the Forsaken crowding around the elevator shaft, desperately trying to escape to the surface. Marcus looked at the vial, then at the refugees fleeing past him, then back at the research complex where Project Whispering Death's documentation and specimens remained housed in chambers that, if they could be sealed before the contamination spread, might preserve the evidence needed to expose what the Royal Apothecary Society had done. He ran back toward the laboratories. The heat from the vial was becoming painful now, burning through his gloves and scorching the already dead flesh beneath. Marcus's mind raced through calculations, trying to estimate how long he had before detonation. 20 seconds, maybe 30 if he was fortunate. Enough time to reach the primary research chambers. Enough time to seal the doors and trap the blight inside with the evidence. assuming the blight didn't kill him first, assuming the detonation didn't simply destroy everything, obliterating the proof that might otherwise save countless Alliance civilians from transformation into unwilling Forsaken. 15 seconds. Marcus burst through the entrance to Chamber 7, where Farinell kept his most sensitive documentation. The room was in chaos. Files scattered everywhere. Experimental specimens thrashing in their restraints. Alchemical equipment leaking compounds that created rainbow-colored clouds of toxic vapor. But the main archive remained intact. A vault constructed from treated stone that had survived countless magical catastrophes over the centuries. 10 seconds. Marcus threw the vial into the vault. He slammed the door shut, engaging the sealing mechanisms that would contain the blast within the reinforced chamber. The locks clicked into place with finality. 5 seconds. Marcus stumbled backward. He'd done everything possible. The evidence was protected. The blight would be contained within the vault rather than spreading through the corridors where refugees continued to flee. Subject 27 and the other escaped specimens would have to be dealt with by others, but at least the worst of the catastrophe could be mitigated. He'd done something good. Something that might matter. The vault exploded. The force of the detonation punched through the treated stone like it was parchment, sending fragments of wall scattering across Chamber 7 in a lethal spray. The blight followed, a roiling cloud of emerald destruction that consumed everything it touched. Marcus felt it impact his body, felt his dead flesh begin to dissolve under its corrosive power. This was how he would end, destroyed by the same weapon he'd helped perfect. There was a certain poetic justice in that. But as consciousness began to fade, Marcus realized something. The vault door had channeled most of the blast inward, incinerating the research documentation and specimens housed inside. The evidence of Project Whispering Death, the carefully compiled data about the field hospitals, the modified plague variants, the projected timeline for mass transformation of Alliance populations, all of it was gone. Destroyed by his own attempt to protect it. He'd accomplished nothing except ensuring the conspiracy would remain hidden. The last thing Marcus Thrale experienced before the blight finished its work was the sound of footsteps approaching through the smoke. Multiple sets of feet, moving with coordinated purpose. He tried to turn his head, tried to see who was coming, but his body no longer responded to commands. A figure bent over him. Through the greenish haze, Marcus recognized Subject 27's reanimated face. "Don't worry," the specimen whispered. "You did exactly what we needed. The evidence is destroyed. The Royal Apothecary Society will claim the catastrophe was caused by Scourge infiltrators or Alliance saboteurs. Project Whispering Death will continue. Lady Sylvanas will get her army of unwilling conscripts, and there's nothing anyone can do to stop it." Subject 27's smile was genuine, even warm. "Thank you for your service to the Forsaken. You'll be remembered as a tragic loss. A promising researcher who died trying to contain a terrible accident." Marcus wanted to scream, wanted to warn someone, anyone, about what was coming. But the blight had already consumed his throat, his lungs, his capacity for speech. All he could do was lie there, dissolving into slag, while Subject 27 watched with interest. "The Lich King taught us many things," the specimen continued conversationally. "How to create plagues, how to raise the dead, how to turn entire kingdoms into armies of the damned. Lady Sylvanas thinks she's freed us from his control, but she's just applying the same methods toward different ends. Project Whispering. Death is the plague of undeath with better public relations. And you've ensured nobody will learn the truth until it's far too late to matter." The footsteps retreated. Marcus was alone with the spreading blight, alone with the knowledge that his final act had been catastrophic failure. He'd tried to expose the conspiracy and instead guaranteed its success. He'd tried to save lives and instead doomed thousands to transformation they would never choose willingly. The Undercity's depths had claimed another victim. The research would continue in other facilities, under other names. The field hospitals would keep operating, infecting their patients with modified plague variants, carefully calibrated to manifest after enough time had passed to prevent anyone from connecting the symptoms to their source. And somewhere in the world above, Alliance civilians would continue seeking treatment for minor ailments, never suspecting the cure was worse than any disease. Marcus Thrale's consciousness finally faded, taking with it the last witness to what the Royal Apothecary Society had become in the name of survival. The blight continued its work long after he was gone. The alarm crystals throughout the Undercity began screaming 3 hours after Marcus Thrale dissolved into chemical slag. Commander Arcturus Brightsong of the Argent Crusade had been monitoring magical disturbances from his outpost in the Western Plaguelands when the cascading resonance signature erupted across his detection arrays. The pattern was unmistakable. Catastrophic containment failure involving necromantic compounds. Exactly the kind of signature that appeared when someone was experimenting with variants of the plague of undeath. He'd mobilized his strike team within minutes. Now, standing in the ruins of what the Forsaken called the Apothecarium, Arcturus struggled to process the scale of the disaster. Bodies, or what remained of them, were scattered throughout the corridor system like discarded refuse. Some had been partially dissolved by alchemical contamination. Others bore signs of violence, torn apart by something with tremendous strength and no regard for mercy. The air itself felt wrong, thick with vapors that made his protective enchantments flicker and strain. "Commander," called one of his paladins, a young woman named Thera Dawnlight. She was examining a sealed vault door that had been blown outward from the inside. "You need to see this." Arcturus picked his way through the debris. The vault's interior was scorched black, the stone walls bearing the characteristic pitting pattern of concentrated blight exposure. Nothing organic could have survived the detonation, but scattered among the ashes and melted metal were fragments of what appeared to be documentation. Vellum pages with handwritten notes, crystallized data storage matrices, even a few intact journals whose covers had somehow resisted the conflagration. Thera handed him one of the journals. The cover identified its owner as Marcus Thrale, Assistant Researcher, Royal Apothecary Society. Arcturus began reading. The early entries were mundane. Experimental protocols, supply requisitions, observations about specimen responses to various plague compounds. Thrale wrote with clinical precision, documenting his work without editorial comment. A professional researcher doing his job. But about halfway through the journal, the tone changed. The entries became longer, more personal. Thrale began questioning the experimental protocols, wondering about the source of certain specimens, noting discrepancies between official research objectives and the actual work being conducted in the deeper laboratories. Then came the entries about Project Whispering Death. Arcturus read them twice, certain he must be misunderstanding. But the words remained consistent, their meaning unavoidable. The Forsaken weren't just developing weapons against the Scourge. They were engineering a long-term biological attack against Alliance civilian populations, using field hospitals as vectors for modified plague variants that would transform living humans into undead over the course of months. The resulting casualties would then be raised as new Forsaken, expanding their numbers while simultaneously crippling Alliance demographic stability. It was genocide disguised as humanitarian aid. "Thera," Arcturus said quietly, "send word to Hearthglen. Priority Alpha. We need to audit every field hospital that's received Forsaken medical supplies in the past 6 months. Full quarantine protocols. Nobody leaves those facilities until we've verified they haven't been exposed to experimental plague variants." The paladin's face had gone pale as she read over his shoulder. "Commander, if this is accurate, if they've already deployed the modified blight, we could be looking at tens of thousands of infected civilians, maybe more. The incubation period Thrale describes would mean people are already carrying the plague without showing symptoms." Arcturus closed the journal. His hands were shaking, though whether from rage or horror, he couldn't determine. The Horde needs to know about this. Immediately. If the Forsaken have launched Project Whispering Death without War Chief Thrall's approval, it represents a violation of every treaty and agreement that holds the Alliance Horde ceasefire together. And if Thrall did approve it, the question hung in the scorched air between them. Arcturus had no answer. The political implications were staggering. If the Horde leadership had sanctioned Project Whispering Death, it meant war. Genuine, total war between the factions. The kind of conflict that would make the recent Northrend campaign look like a border skirmish. The Alliance would have no choice but to respond with overwhelming force against an enemy that had proven willing to use weapons of mass transformation against civilian populations. But if the project had been conducted without Horde approval, if this was the Royal Apothecary Society acting independently, then the situation was somehow worse. It meant the Forsaken were operating outside the Horde command structure, pursuing their own agenda with weapons capable of reshaping Azeroth's demographic composition. It meant Lady Sylvanas Windrunner was either complicit in a conspiracy against her own allies, or had lost control of her subordinates to the point where they could launch biological attacks without her knowledge. Either scenario was catastrophic. Collect everything that survived the blast, Arcturus ordered. Documents, specimens, equipment, anything that might provide evidence. We need to... The sound of footsteps interrupted him. Multiple individuals moving through the ruined corridors with purpose. Arcturus drew his sword, blessed steel that had been consecrated by High Priest Icilian himself. Beside him, Thera kindled light into her palms, ready to unleash holy fire against whatever emerged from the smoke. What emerged was a Forsaken patrol. 6 undead soldiers wearing the armor of the Royal Apothecary Society's security detail. Their weapons drawn and their eyeless faces turned toward the Argent Crusade team with obvious hostility. Behind them came a figure in elaborate robes. Not armor, but ceremonial garments bearing the insignia of the Desolate Council. Arcturus recognized him from intelligence briefings. Master Apothecary Farinell, one of the most senior researchers in the Royal Apothecary Society. One of the minds behind the new plague. One of the architects of Project Whispering Death. Farinell's gaze swept across the vault chamber, taking in the Argent Crusade personnel and the evidence they'd collected. His expression remained neutral, but Arcturus detected something in those dead eyes. Not concern, exactly. More like calculation. "Commander Brightsong," Farinell said. His voice was surprisingly cultured, carrying the accent of Lord Aeron's former nobility. "I must commend your rapid response. The Argent Crusade's monitoring capabilities are clearly superior to our intelligence estimates suggested." Arcturus kept his sword leveled at the apothecary. "Master Farinell, I'm placing you under arrest for crimes against the living. You and your subordinates will accompany us to Hearthglen, where you'll answer questions about Project Whispering Death and the field hospital deployments." Farinell tilted his head slightly. "I'm afraid that's not possible, Commander. You're currently standing in Forsaken territory, deep within the Undercity. You have no jurisdiction here, and your presence represents an act of military aggression against a sovereign Horde nation." He gestured toward the collected evidence. "Additionally, the materials you've confiscated are classified research documentation. Their removal would constitute theft of state secrets. These documents detail a biological attack against Alliance civilians." Arcturus could feel his grip tightening on his sword hilt. "Your research has killed innocent people, is still killing them, if the timelines in these journals are accurate. Researcher Thrale's journals contain numerous inaccuracies and speculative claims." Farinell spoke with the patience of someone explaining obvious facts to a slow student. He was experiencing psychological deterioration due to prolonged exposure to experimental compounds. His later entries reflect paranoid delusions rather than factual observations. "The catastrophe you're investigating was caused by his mental breakdown. He sabotaged containment systems and triggered the cascade failures that destroyed this research complex." The lie was smooth, practiced. Arcturus had no doubt Farinell had been preparing this narrative since the moment the alarm crystals started screaming. Blame the dead researcher. Claim mental illness. Dismiss the evidence as fabrications produced by a compromised mind. It was a strategy that might actually work if the Horde leadership wanted to avoid confronting the truth. "The field hospitals," Arcturus said. "We're going to audit them. If we find evidence of plague deployment..." "You'll find medical supplies and humanitarian aid," Farinell interrupted. "Nothing more sinister than bandages and antiseptics. The Forsaken have been working to improve relations with the Alliance. Lady Sylvanas herself approved the field hospital initiative as a gesture of goodwill." He smiled, an expression that looked wrong on his skeletal features. If your audit discovers anything suspicious, I suspect you'll find it was introduced by Scarlet Crusade infiltrators attempting to frame the Forsaken for atrocities. They've made such attempts before. Arcturus felt the trap closing. Farinell was right. If the plague variants were as sophisticated as Thrale's journal suggested, they would be nearly impossible to detect before symptoms manifested. The Argent Crusade could audit the field hospitals and find nothing obviously wrong. By the time infected patients started showing signs of transformation, months would have passed. The connection to Forsaken medical supplies would be circumstantial at best, easily explained away as contamination or sabotage by third parties. Meanwhile, the Royal Apothecary Society would have months to refine their cover story, destroy remaining evidence, and prepare additional denials. Project Whispering Death would continue, modified perhaps to account for increased scrutiny, but fundamentally unchanged in its objectives. Unless Arcturus could prevent that. "Thera," he said quietly, "activate the recall beacon." The Paladin's eyes widened. "Commander, that's a direct strike order. If we call in..." "Do it." Thera pulled a crystalline device from her belt. The beacon activated with a pulse of golden light that shot through the Undercity's ceiling, piercing stone and earth to reach the surface. Within seconds, it would alert every Argent Crusade outpost within 50 miles. Reinforcements would be mobilized. Siege equipment would be positioned around the Undercity's entrances. High Priest Isilian himself would probably lead the assault. The Forsaken would interpret it as an act of war. Farinell's expression shifted from calculated neutrality to something approaching genuine surprise. "Commander, you've just authorized a military strike against a Horde capital city. The political consequences will be severe," Arcturus agreed, "but less severe than allowing Project Whispering Death to continue. You've engineered a weapon that transforms living populations into undead without consent or warning. You've deployed it against Alliance civilians under the guise of humanitarian aid. And you're standing here telling me that we should simply accept your denials and allow the operation to proceed." He raised his voice, addressing the entire chamber. "I am Commander Arcturus Brightsong of the Argent Crusade. By the authority vested in me by High Priest Isilian and the Silver Hand, I'm declaring the Undercity a hostile zone. All personnel affiliated with the Royal Apothecary Society are hereby designated as enemy combatants. Surrender now, or face the light's judgment." The Forsaken security detail raised their weapons. Farinell made a gesture, and alchemical vials appeared in several hands, filled with liquids that Arcturus recognized from intelligence reports as concentrated plague compounds. The battle began. Thera unleashed holy fire first, the golden flames washing across the corridor in a wave that forced the Forsaken soldiers to scatter. Arcturus charged through the opening, his blessed sword leaving trails of light in the air. He reached the nearest security guard and struck, the consecrated steel cutting through undead flesh with righteous fury. The Forsaken fought back with desperate efficiency. They weren't warriors, not really, just researchers and functionaries who'd been trained in basic combat procedures. But they had numbers, and they had plague weapons, and in the confined space of the ruined laboratories, those advantages mattered. One of the alchemical vials shattered against Thera's shoulder. She screamed as the contents ate through her protective enchantments and began dissolving the flesh beneath. Arcturus grabbed her, channeling light into the wound, burning away the plague contamination before it could spread. The healing hurt worse than the initial injury, but it saved her life. More Forsaken were arriving, dozens of them pouring through the corridor system from other parts of the Undercity. Arcturus realized with growing horror that Farinell must have been preparing for this possibility. Had security personnel staged throughout the complex, ready to respond to potential raids. The Argent Crusade strike team was outnumbered 20-1. "Fall back," Arcturus ordered. His team began a fighting retreat, moving toward the elevator shaft that represented their only escape route. Behind them, the Forsaken pressed forward, hurling plague vials and firing crossbow bolts coated with substances that made even glancing wounds potentially fatal. They reached the elevator shaft to find the lift platform had been sabotaged. The chains were cut, the pulley system destroyed. The only way up was climbing. 100 feet of vertical shaft, exposed and vulnerable to attack from below. Arcturus made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. "Thera, take the team and start climbing. I'll hold them here." The young paladin's face twisted with anguish. "Commander, you can't—" "That's an order." Arcturus pushed her toward the shaft. "Get to the surface. Warn Hearthglen. Tell them everything you saw here. Tell them Project Whispering Death is real and it's already deployed. The Alliance needs to know. Even if—" He trailed off. "Even if I don't make it out alive to confirm it." His team began climbing. Arcturus turned to face the advancing Forsaken, his sword blazing with light that pushed back the greenish gloom. He was one man against an army. One paladin standing between Project Whispering Death secrets and the soldiers sent to protect those secrets. He knew how this would end. But as Farinell emerged from the crowd of security personnel, the Master Apothecary's expression suggested he knew something Arcturus didn't. Something that made this final stand meaningless in ways the commander couldn't yet comprehend. "You're very brave, Brightsong," Farinell observed. "Also very foolish. Did you really think the Argent Crusade would be able to stop Project Whispering Death by raiding a single research facility? We have laboratories throughout Forsaken territory. Backup documentation stored in secure locations. The field hospitals have already deployed the modified plague to 14 Alliance settlements across 3 provinces." His smile returned. "Your sacrifice here accomplishes nothing except providing us with a martyr to justify increased security measures," Arcturus charged. He made it perhaps 10 feet before the plague bolts hit him. Multiple crossbow quarrels, each one coated with compounds specifically engineered to overcome holy protections. He felt his consecrated armor begin to corrode, felt the light within him gutter and fade as necromantic toxins flooded his system. He collapsed, his sword clattering from nerveless fingers. Above him he could hear his team still climbing. Thera's voice calling orders, keeping the others moving even as Forsaken soldiers began ascending the shaft in pursuit. They might make it, might reach the surface and deliver their warning. Or they might be caught and killed, their evidence destroyed, their testimony dismissed as the ravings of extremists looking to justify aggression against the Horde. Farinell knelt beside Arcturus, studying him with clinical interest. "The modified plague I've introduced to your system is quite fascinating, Commander. It won't kill you immediately. Instead, it will preserve your consciousness while transforming your physical form. Over the next several hours, you'll experience the transition from living to undead. Your memories will remain intact. Your personality will survive. But your body will become something new. Something better suited to existence in a world that no longer needs the living." Horror clawed through Arcturus's fading awareness. Farinell wasn't killing him, wasn't even trying to extract information through torture. The Master Apothecary was transforming him into a test subject, using the modified plague to demonstrate Project Whispering Death's ultimate refinement, the ability to preserve the victim's mind while destroying their fundamental humanity. "You'll join us eventually," Farinell continued. "Not today, perhaps, not even next week. But within a month, you'll wake up as one of the Forsaken, and you'll remember everything. How you tried to stop us, how you failed, how the light abandoned you when you needed it most. That knowledge will break something essential inside you. It always does." He stood, gesturing to his security personnel. "Take him to the preservation chambers. I want continuous monitoring throughout the transformation process. Commander Brightsong is going to teach us how paladins respond to plague-induced undeath." Hands closed around Arcturus, dragging him away from the elevator shaft, away from his team, away from any hope of escape or rescue. He tried to pray, tried to call upon the light for one final miracle. Nothing answered. The light was gone. Or perhaps it had simply realized that some battles couldn't be won through faith and righteous fury. Perhaps it had abandoned Azeroth to the consequences of the choices its inhabitants made. Choices that led to laboratories beneath ruined cities, to research programs that turned healing into weapon delivery, to field hospitals that promised salvation while administering transformation. Arcturus Brightsong's consciousness faded as the plague began its terrible work, remaking him cell by cell into something that would serve the very cause he'd tried to destroy. 3 months later, the first symptoms appeared among Alliance civilians who had received treatment at Forsaken field hospitals. The transformed patients rarely understood what was happening to them. The modified plague was subtle, working slowly enough that victims attributed their deteriorating health to natural illness. By the time the truth became obvious, when skin began to mottle and decay, when heartbeats ceased but consciousness remained, it was far too late for intervention. Some chose to end their own existence rather than complete the transformation. Others embraced their new state, joining the Forsaken willingly or through simple acceptance of an irreversible condition. A few tried to warn others, tried to trace the infection back to its source. Those few were quietly eliminated by Forsaken agents who'd been positioned throughout Alliance territories specifically for that purpose. The Royal Apothecary Society monitored it all from the Undercity, collecting data and refining their techniques. Project Whispering Death had exceeded all expectations. The field hospitals continued operating. The Alliance remained ignorant of the true threat, and Lady Sylvanas' vision of a vastly expanded Forsaken population was becoming reality. Deep in the Undercity's rebuilt research complex, Master Apothecary Farinell stood before a reinforced observation chamber. Inside, strapped to an examination table, was what remained of Commander Arcturus Brightsong. The transformation had preserved the Paladin's consciousness perfectly. His body was undead now, kept functioning through necromantic energy rather than biological processes. But his mind remained intact, aware, terrified, and completely unable to prevent the horror of what he'd become. Farinell made notes on a crystalline data tablet, documenting the psychological deterioration patterns that accompanied forced transformation of light-blessed individuals. The research would prove invaluable when Project Whispering Death began targeting Alliance military personnel and clerics. Understanding how to break the faith of the devout would make the subsequent conversions much easier to manage. "How do you feel, Commander?" Farinell asked through the observation chamber's communication array. Brightsong didn't answer. Couldn't answer. The modified plague had preserved his consciousness but removed his ability to speak. He could only watch, helpless and aware, as Farinell continued the experiments that would help perfect the techniques used to transform living populations into unwilling Forsaken. "Don't worry," Farinell said kindly. "Your suffering serves a greater purpose. Every data point we collect from your transformation helps us refine Project Whispering Death, helps us save more Forsaken lives by expanding our population. You should take comfort in that. Your people will remember you as a hero who died trying to expose a terrible conspiracy." He paused. "They'll never know you succeeded only in becoming part of it." Farinell left the observation chamber, his mind already turning to the next phase of the project. 14 Alliance settlements had been infected so far. The plan called for 50 by year's end, 100 within 2 years. Eventually, entire provinces would be transformed, their populations joining the Forsaken, whether they wished to or not. It was genocide dressed as expansion, transformation masquerading as salvation, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. Behind the reinforced glass, Arcturus Brightsong screamed silently into the darkness that had become his eternal existence. Screamed for the victims he'd failed to save. Screamed for the justice that would never come. Screamed for the world that had allowed places like the Undercity to exist, where horror was justified as necessity and atrocity was called survival. Nobody heard him. Nobody ever would. The plague labs continued their work, and the field hospitals kept offering aid to those who didn't know they were already doomed, and Azeroth spun on through the void, ignorant of the darkness growing in the ruins beneath Lordaeron's shattered capital. This was the truth behind the plague labs and field hospitals. This was the price of survival when the cost was measured in souls.